My experience of Derek Jarman, at least one of my primary experiences of Derek Jarman, was through Ken Russell's film The Devils. So I'm a huge fan of Ken Russell's movies, and I had had a kind of primal experience seeing The Devils and The Exorcist together on a double bill at the Phoenix East Finchley, which is one of the oldest cinemas in the country, as a late night double bill in the 1970s. And it was, it was a fairly overwhelming experience. One of the crucial things about The Devils is the way it looks. And of course, The Devils sets were designed by Derek Jarman. And what was really fascinating is that, Ken Russell was this huge, larger-than-life character. He filled a room. He had stories about it. As I said, the stories would change every time he told them. But every time he talked about The Devils, he talked about Jarman as being pretty much the key defining influence, along with the costumes, on how the film looked and how it had that modernity that he wanted, so that when you watch the film, you're not watching it as, an ancient thing. You're watching it as something which is modern. Now, obviously, later on in Jarman's career, that intertwining of the ancient and the modern, of the historical and the futuristic, of the past and the present, actually becomes a kind of key thing. So my introduction was, as I said, through The Devils, through that design, and then through really, really being struck by that thing about the past and present intertwining. I was in Manchester in the 1980s, and I was doing English at Manchester University. And this sounds like such ancient history, but in the early 1980s, video was a big thing, okay? Because, wow, you can watch a film on television when you want to watch it, okay? This is a new thing. And me and some friends of ours were thinking, rather than reading all these Shakespeare plays, should we just get videos of them, and then there was a video recorder in the student union. We figured, we'll get a room, right, and we'll watch a whole bunch of Shakespeare productions. We figured that would be an easier way than actually reading them. And I remember ploughing through a bunch of Shakespeare movies of fairly variable quality until we got to The Tempest. And suddenly you get to The Tempest and everyone wakes up. What's great about it is that it feels really modern and immediate and dangerous and cheeky and funny and magical and strange. And I guarantee you that most of us who wrote essays about The Tempest based them on Jarman's Tempest. And we didn't, I knew who Jarman was, but most of the people in the room didn't, because they weren't all boring film fans, I remember that. It will live with me that everyone's suddenly, literally doing this, literally sitting up and sitting forward and going, oh, this is interesting, what's going on? My experience of meeting him was at the very end of his life. And what happened was, I was the film critic for Radio 1, which back then was the pop music station. So it had a young audience. It was the biggest station in the country at the time, because there weren't so many radio stations. And I did a film program, an hour-long film program on that. This is back in the 90s. And we were offered Derek Jarman as an interview. And I went to interview him, and I hadn't realized how ill he was when I went to interview him. And I was shown into the flat, into the room, and he was very weak, very fragile. He was, his health was failing, but he was like this, he was funny, he was cheeky, he was joking with me in a way that I actually didn't quite understand at the time. And over that course of that half an hour, I just got this real sense that you're really keen for other people to be fired up by this. And no matter what's happening in your life, which is actually something very profound, that's secondary to the fact that you've got something that's coming out and you want people to talk about it and you want people to be engaged with it, and you're willing to do this interview now. And I remember taking the tape back, because it was, it was radio, and took the tape back, and I started playing it to the producers. And at first they were quite shocked by how fragile his voice sounded. But of course, 10, 20, 30 seconds into it, you could hear that, well, yes, the voice was fragile, but behind it, everything else was there. And I just remember being really impressed by the level of enthusiasm he had for passing this on. And actually, that's a really big part of it, was you always felt that what he really gave a shit about was passing this on to, whoever the next, so not me, but the listeners, whoever the next set, if there's some 15-year-old out there listening to this who's going to go and, watch that film or get that thing, and then they'll discover this whole other, oh, he did this, and then he did that, and then who's that artist that he's talking about? And I think that's probably true. I think he probably led people by the hand to a load of other things. And I would also think that he would imagine himself as a conduit to that. It was almost like, come through this work to this other stuff behind it. And again, it's the past, the present, and the future all kind of coexisting at the same time. He did seem to attract people to him. I mean, how did he end up doing The Devils? How did he end up working with... How is it that this extraordinary, Dexter Fletcher, this extraordinary parade of people passed through those portals? And I think it was, it's partly that he clearly had a very welcoming personality. As I said, in my experience of him was late in life, but he was still, charming and friendly as much as it was possible to be. The great example of this, and I know that she's involved in the campaign, is Sandy Powell's story. Somehow she decided that Jarman was somebody who was inspirational and, who was kind of firing her imagination. So she found his phone number. I think she might have got it off of Lindsay Kemp. And she just presented herself. I think the way she said it was, well, I just rang him up and said, I'm Sandy Powell and I'm doing this stuff and you should find it interesting. And he went, all right. Clearly, he had something that people felt that they could just approach him and talk to him. And the other thing is, I think that all of those people that we're talking about are all people who had talent and interest. And I think that that's what he liked. I think he could tell if somebody cared about something. I don't think he was particularly bothered about whether they were trained. I think what he cared about was whether they actually cared. And you look at that extraordinary roster of people and they all sort of passed through that portal and then went on to do extraordinary things. And, that's not coincidental. That's not coincidental. That happens because you create an environment in which people feel that they can knock on your door and go, hello, I'm so-and-so, you've never heard of me, but I've got a really good idea. I think that there is a certain amount of magic in all of this. I think, when you look at his version of the Tempest, I think that when you look at that list of people that we've just talked about, when you look at these kind of weird synchronous things that happen, there's a certain amount of magic going on in all of it. And I think it sort of fits in with his art anyway. And I like the idea that in that space that meant so much to him, it's not just what he took from the space, it's what he brought to it. And I do think that that's a perfectly noble thought, because I like the idea that, the spirit of something exists in the landscape, in the building, in the plants. And when you look at how much inspiration he took from it, it's impossible to think, well, it's just a place that he liked. So I think it's a great idea, because I actually do believe in, quite apart from all the other things about talent and hard work and everything, I do think there is in the perfect circumstances, there's that thing that Friedkin refers to as the movie God. There is something else that just, it's that. And if you're going to believe it about anywhere, you should probably believe it about the cottage.